Montana Territory. June of 1881, the wind carried dust across the valley floor as Wilder Westcott reined in his stallion at the edge of his sprawling cattle range, the sun sharp behind him, and a stranger collapsed in the dirt ahead. She was on her knees, palms scraped raw, dress torn at the hem. Her boots were falling apart, and her braid had come loose, a mess of tangled brown hair hanging across her face. Wilder dismounted in one smooth motion, his boots crunching dry earth as he approached. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but clear. "You hurt?" The woman looked up, blinking against the sun. Her lips were cracked. "Just thirsty," she whispered. "Please, I just need water." Wilder crouched beside her without hesitation and handed over his canteen. She drank with both hands wrapped tight around the metal, eyes closed like she had not tasted water in days. "What's your name?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "Olive Lark." "How far you been walking, Miss Lark?" She set the canteen down gently. "Since yesterday morning. I was riding with a freight wagon out of Helena. They threw me off when I could not pay my share anymore." Wilder's brows drew together. "They left you in the middle of nowhere. They said I was just a burden," she said quietly. He looked past her, scanning the empty trail behind, not even a broken wheel track. "You got family anywhere?" "No," she said. "Not anymore." He straightened up and offered her a calloused hand. "Come on." "You are coming with me." She hesitated. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. "I have more water, food too, and a roof." She took his hand. The Westcott Ranch sat in a wide basin of grassland, hemmed in by cottonwoods and the distant rise of mountains. The house was large, timber-framed and solid, built with Wilder's own hands over 6 years, long after the war and even longer after his father's debts had nearly taken everything. He had built it alone. No woman had ever stayed there. Wilder led Olive into the kitchen, set a stew pot on the stove, and told her to sit. She did, folding her hands in her lap, trying not to look too small in a room made for someone else's life. "You live out here alone?" she asked. "I do." "No wife?" "No," he said simply. "Have not found the right one?" She nodded, eyes flicking around the room, the polished pine cupboards, the iron stove, the blue china plate on the wall that did not match anything else. "How long were you with that freight wagon?" he asked. 2 weeks. Before that I was working at a boarding house in Butte. Before that, a long trail of places I do not care to name. She looked down at her hands. "I am tired of running." He said nothing at first. "Then you do not have to keep running." She looked at him, startled. "You can stay here," he said. "As long as you need. Safe." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She nodded once, and he went back to stirring the stew. By the time the stars had come out and the crickets started singing, Olive lay clean and fed in the guest room. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet creak of the house settling into night. It felt too big, too quiet, but not in a way that frightened her. Wilder, down the hall, sat by the hearth with a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. He stared into the flames, thinking of the way her voice had trembled when she said she had no one. The way her eyes darted around like she was still being hunted. He had known fear like that, known what it meant to carry it for years. The next morning came bright and dry. Wilder was already outside feeding the horses. Olive stepped out into the yard wearing a borrowed shirt tucked into her skirt, sleeves rolled up. He looked up from the trough and paused. She smiled, a little unsure. "I can pull my weight. I am not used to sitting around." He nodded once. "You can help with the chickens. Coop's this way." They worked side by side all morning. She caught on quick, moving with quiet focus. He liked that about her: no complaints, no fuss, just steady hands and clear eyes. At midday, they sat on the porch with bread and beans, the sky wide and open above them. "Why did you build a place this big if you live alone?" she asked. Wilder shrugged. I guess I always figured someday. It would not be just me. Olive looked down at her plate, cheeks warming. I meant it, he said. You can stay as long as you want. She met his eyes. Thank you. Over the next week, Olive settled in like she had always belonged there. She mended tack, baked bread, even helped Wilder drive cattle to the west pasture. In the evenings, they sat close by the fire, never quite touching but never far. One night, as thunder rolled in the distance and rain tapped soft against the windows, Olive stood by the hearth, drying her hair with a cloth. You ever think about starting a family? She asked, not looking at him. Wilder set down his cup. I did, years ago, but nothing came of it. She turned toward him. Maybe it is not too late. Their eyes held. The room felt still. He stood slowly, walked toward her, stopping just close enough she could feel the warmth off his skin. I have never asked a woman to stay before, he said. Never had a reason to. Olive's heart pounded. But I want you to be the first. Her breath caught. Not just for a while, he added. I want you to stay for good. She felt her eyes sting. You do not even know everything about me. I know enough, he said. I know you are strong, I know you are kind, and I know you make this place feel like something it has never been home. He reached for her hand. She curled her fingers through his. I want to stay, she whispered. And he pulled her gently into his arms. Outside, the storm passed. Inside, the fire burned warm. The cottonwoods had filled out thick with summer by the time Olive began staying in the main house rather than the guest room. It wasn't spoken of, but one night her lamp never lit in the room down the hall, and by morning her shawl hung beside Wilder's on the entry hook. No ceremony, no declarations, just two people moving through the same space, no longer apart. Wilder came in from the barn late one evening, his shirt damp with sweat from hauling feed. Olive was peeling potatoes at the table, her sleeves rolled high and her forehead damp. The lantern flickered low between them, throwing soft shadows on the walls. You ever think of planting something out back? She asked without glancing up. There's good soil behind the chicken run. I've thought on it, he said, pulling off his boots. Never had the time to see it through. Well, I've got time, and I know how. My mother used to keep a garden back when we lived near the river in Missouri. Wilder leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. What did she grow? Tomatoes mostly, she said, but she loved hollyhocks. Said they were stubborn flowers, grew tall even when you didn't want them to. He smiled faintly, watching the way her hands moved over the knife. You're like that, like a flower. Like something that keeps standing, no matter the dirt it's planted in. She paused, the blade stilled. You always talk like that, he shook his head. No, only with you. The silence that followed felt full, not empty. By early July they'd built raised beds together. Olive knelt in the dirt each morning before the heat came, coaxing seedlings up and brushing soil from her palms with a quiet pride. Wilder watched her from the porch sometimes, his coffee cooling in his hand, a peace settling in his chest that he hadn't known he'd missed. One afternoon, Wilder returned from the southern fence line with blood on his sleeve and a torn palm. Olive met him at the porch with a basin already filled, as though she'd known before he stepped off his horse. Barbed wire, she asked, guiding him to the bench. Snapped clean through. Caught me on the backswing. She wrung out a cloth and pressed it firm to the wound. You ought to wear gloves. Didn't plan on bleeding today. She kept her touch steady, not delicate but careful, the way someone is with things they mean to keep. You're quiet, he said after a moment. Just thinking. About, she paused, eyes on his hand. What it'd be like to stay through winter if you'd want that. I meant what I said, he replied. You're not here on accident. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. What is it? Sometimes it feels too easy, she admitted. Like I'm waiting for it to fall apart. It won't, he said. Not if we hold it together. That night, she moved in closer when they lay down, her fingers curled beneath his shirt at his side like she needed to feel something solid to believe it was real. Late July brought heat so thick it hung in the air even after dark. They took to sleeping with the windows open, the night sounds of frogs and distant coyotes drifting in with the breeze. One night, Olive sat up in bed, the sheet tangled at her waist. "I had a dream," she said. "You weren't here." I was back in that dry stretch near Helena, walking again. Wilder turned to her, voice low. "You're not." "I know." She looked at him, eyes clear despite the darkness. "But I still wake up afraid sometimes, like I'm still out there." "We make a life day by day," he said. "We don't owe the past anything." She reached for his hand then, entwining her fingers with his. "Just don't leave, Wilder." "I won't," he said. "You're the first person this place has ever been waiting for," and she believed him. By August, the first tomatoes showed up on the vine. Olive brought them in with dirt still clinging to their skins, and laid them in the bowl on the table like they were something sacred. Wilder built a frame for the hollyhocks she'd planted near the porch, and though they hadn't bloomed yet, she touched the leaves each morning like greeting an old friend. Their life was slow, measured, full of unspoken things that didn't need saying. She mended shirts by the fire while he sharpened tools. He watched her laugh at the goat's stubbornness and thought how he'd never once minded their braying until now. One evening, as they shelled beans on the porch, Olive set her bowl aside. "I want to marry you." Wilder looked up from his work. "You do," she nodded, face steady. "Not for safety, not out of fear, just because I want to stand with you. I want to wake up on this porch when I'm old with you beside me." He leaned in, kissed her brow. "Then that's what we'll do." And just like that, the sun dipped behind the ridge, and the sky turned the color of ripe peaches, and they sat there with their fingers stained green and their hearts wide open. The morning they rode to town together, a hawk circled overhead, casting its shadow across the prairie like a passing thought. Olive wore a soft blue dress she'd stitched over weeks of quiet evenings, and Wilder had shaved, though he hadn't said anything about it. They saddled the wagon without fanfare. Her hand brushed his once as she climbed up beside him, and he didn't let go right away. The road into Miles City was long and rutted, lined with sunburnt grasses, and the occasional fence post leaning like an old man too tired to stand straight. They passed a man driving sheep and a girl chasing a runaway bonnet. No one looked twice at the couple riding side by side in a wagon built for hauling feed. But Olive noticed the way Wilder's hand stayed close to hers, even on the reins. "I ain't been to town since the spring market," he said as they crossed the wide, shallow creek that marked the edge of the settlement. "You mind it?" "I don't mind it," he said. "But I don't need it." They stopped first at the mercantile, where Olive picked through bolts of calico and asked the storekeeper about sugar in bulk. Wilder traded 3 hides for salt, lamp oil, and a length of rope. When they stepped outside again, she held the wrapped fabric to her chest like it might blow away in the wind. "I want to make curtains for the front room," she said. "Anything you want," he said. "It's your home too." They walked past the smith's forge, where a boy no older than 10 pumped the bellows for his father. Olive watched him for a moment. "Did you ever think about having children?" Wilder looked down the road, jaw working. "I used to wonder if I'd be like my father," he said. "He was hard, worked a man twice over, never said much unless it was to correct." She waited. "I think I'd be different," he said. "I'd teach him to be steady, not scared." She nodded once. "I think you'd be good at it." They didn't speak again until they reached the church. It was small, whitewashed, with a bell that hadn't rung since the last frost. A woman swept the steps, her skirts flaring with each pass. Wilder tipped his hat and the woman nodded back, eyes lingering on Olive. Inside, the pews were empty but for a man tuning a fiddle in the front row. He looked up as they entered. "We're not here for service," Wilder said. "We're looking to speak to the Reverend." "He's out visiting a family near the river," the man replied, "but he'll be back by Sunday." Wilder turned to Olive. "We'll come back then." Outside, the wind had picked up, stirring dust and dry leaves down the street. Olive leaned against the wagon while Wilder loaded supplies. "You think they'll look at us strange, folks in town?" "They might," he said. "But I don't care." She looked at the church steeple. "I don't need a crowd, just you." The ride home was quieter. The sun dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the road, and the horses slowed without needing the reins. Back at the ranch, Olive unpacked the fabric and folded it on the table. Wilder hung the new lantern by the door and tested the wick. Later, as she pinned a square of calico across the front room window, he came to stand behind her. "Does it look right?" she asked. He didn't answer. Just slid his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder. "I want to build a cradle," he said, "even if it sits empty a while." She turned in his arms, expression unreadable. "I'd like that," she said. "I would." They stood there until the room turned gold with the setting sun, and the curtain fluttered against the glass like it had always belonged. The Sunday they returned to town, the morning had broken soft and gray, with low clouds stretched thin across the sky like worn linen. Wilder hitched the wagon while Olive tied her hair back with a strip of muslin. Neither of them spoke on the ride-in, but it wasn't silence born of doubt. There was a calm to it, like the hush before a field blooms, steady and sure. The church bell tolled once as they stepped through the door. Reverend Cal met them at the front, his collar starched and his hands folded loosely across his middle. "You've come to be joined, I take it?" he asked. Wilder nodded. "We have." Cal glanced between them, then gestured to the front pew. "You'll stay until the end of worship, then we'll speak." "I'll not marry two folks without knowing if they mean to stay steady when the wind changes." They sat together, side by side, their knees almost touching. Olive kept her hands folded in her lap, eyes on the wooden cross fixed above the altar. Her breathing stayed even, but Wilder noticed how she pressed the heel of her boot against the floor like she meant to remind herself she was standing firm. After the final hymn, Cal led them to a side room where the windows were open and the curtains stirred with the breeze. "I've known couples who married because they were expected to," he said, "and others because they feared what might come if they didn't. I won't bind two people unless they speak truth." Olive met his gaze. "I've lived on my own since I was 16. I've worked in rooms no one wanted to sleep in and walked roads that near bled my feet raw. I'm not here because I'm desperate. I'm here because he's the first man I ever trusted to speak softly without needing to prove anything." Wilder's hands rested on his thighs, broad and steady. "I've built a life out of quiet things. Fences, horses, a house that holds its corners in the wind, but none of it ever felt like it had a center, until her." Cal nodded slowly. "Then I'll marry you." The ceremony was brief. No witnesses, no music. Just the three of them, the old wooden floor beneath their boots, and the sound of wind passing through the open window. When it was done, Olive reached for Wilder's hand, and he didn't let go. They rode home under a sky just beginning to clear, the light shifting gold along the edges. Wilder stopped the wagon at the edge of the ridge where the land opened wide below them. He looked out at the fields, the barn roof catching light, smoke curling from the chimney. "I want to build on the north side," he said. "Add another room." "Maybe two." "For what?" she asked, brushing a loose hair from her cheek. "For whatever comes next." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I'd like to see something grow here that didn't have to fight for every inch." "You will," he said. "You already have." They returned home as the last of the light faded. Olive walked through the front door without hesitation, setting her bonnet on the hook beside his. She moved through the house like it had always been hers, straight to the kitchen, where she began mixing flour without needing to ask where anything was. Wilder watched her from the doorway, one hand on the frame. "I've never had someone make biscuits just because the day felt right." "You do now," she said without looking up. He stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "I want to give you something." She turned then, flour on her hands. "What for?" "For staying." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small pouch. Inside was a silver brooch shaped like a swallow mid-flight, not new but polished and whole. "It was my mother's," he said. "She wore it the day she married my father. I've kept it wrapped up ever since." Olive took it with both hands gently like it might break. "I'll wear it when the hollyhocks bloom." "They will," he said. "They're stubborn that way." She smiled then, not wide but full. And he stepped forward and kissed her, quiet and sure, with the smell of flour and lye soap between them, and the fire low behind the hearth. That night, they lay in bed with no space between them. Wilder's hand rested at the curve of Olive's hip, her breath warm against his collarbone. Outside, the stars spilled clear across the sky, and the house stood still and solid, wrapped around them like the long arms of something finally at rest. September came in slow, the kind of quiet shift where the wind changed before the leaves did. The mornings turned crisp, and the air smelled faintly of wheat and smoke. Wilder stood at the edge of the corral one dawn, watching Olive walk from the garden with a basket full of turnips and late beans. She moved unhurried, her boots kicking up dust. The sun had just begun to light the frost off the fields, and her breath rose in small clouds. "You ever think about taking in a hired hand?" she asked when she reached him. Wilder leaned on the gate. "You thinking of putting an ad in the paper?" "No. I was thinking about Sela's Wren's boy." "Illy?" He watched her adjust the basket on her hip. "You've met him. He came by while you were out at the creek last week. Asked if we needed eggs. Looked thin like he hadn't had a proper meal in days. Said his father's been sick near 2 months. Wilder nodded once. "If he's willing to work, we've got room." That afternoon, Illy arrived on foot, hat in hand. He couldn't have been more than 19, all limbs and nerves, but he kept his eyes level and his words plain. Olive showed him the bunkhouse, and when she came back, her sleeves were dusty to the elbow. "Boy's never driven cattle," she said, "but he listens." Wilder offered no opinion. Instead, he handed her the saw. "We'll need more wood stacked before the first frost." They worked side by side until the sun dipped behind the ridge. When Wilder passed her the last log, their fingers brushed. She didn't pull away. That night, as they sat by the fire, Olive unrolled a sheet of paper across the kitchen table. It was a drawing, rough lines of a cradle, sketched in charcoal with notes in the margins. "I thought we might build it together," she said. Wilder traced the lines with his thumb. "You've been thinking about it," she nodded. "I was late this month. Still am." He looked up slowly. "You sure?" "No," she said, "but it doesn't feel like nothing." He didn't speak right away. "Then you scared a little," she said. "But not like before." Wilder stood and moved behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "We'll build it either way." The next day, Illy helped Wilder mend the northern fence while Olive stayed in, sewing by the window with the brooch pinned at her collar. The sky held that low, silver light that comes before snow, though the ground was still dry. In the days that followed, Olive's hands stayed busy patching Illy's worn shirts, rendering lard, boiling down apples from the orchard they'd found wild and half-forgotten near the ridge. She didn't say more about the missed month, and Wilder didn't ask. But he brought in extra firewood, and when he passed the cradle plans late one night, she smiled without needing to speak. Mid-October brought a storm that rolled in fast and thick. The wind howled through the eaves and the livestock huddled tight under the lean-to. Wilder stayed up most of the night checking the doors, the windows, the latch on the barn. When he came back in, soaked through and shivering, Olive had a dry shirt waiting by the hearth. "You didn't need to wait up," he said. She handed him the shirt. "You didn't need to go out." He changed by the fire, towel slung over his shoulders, and sat beside her on the rug. "You miss anything?" she asked, voice low. "From before?" He stared into the flames. "I miss my mother's hands," he said. "She was quiet, but when she touched your back, you felt steadier." Olive rested her hand between his shoulder blades. "Like that," he nodded. "Exactly like that." A week later, the snow came in earnest. Wilder taught Ellie to split logs clean, and Olive showed him how to salt meat for winter. The boy said little, but he took to the work with quiet hunger. One evening, Olive stood at the stove, stirring stew, when she paused and pressed a hand low across her belly. Wilder noticed. "You all right?" she nodded, then turned. "I think you should start on the cradle." He let the spoon fall into the pot and crossed the room in 2 steps. "You're sure now?" she smiled, eyes wet. "I am." They stood in the glow of the lantern, her apron dusted with flour, his hands still smelling of cedar. No words passed between them, but everything settled into place just the same. By the time November came, the cradle was nearly finished. Wilder had carved small swallows along the sides, echoing the brooch she still wore every Sunday. Olive had lined it with soft wool, every stitch even. One morning, they rode into town again, this time for cloth and needles, and a small bottle of linseed oil for the cradle's finish. As they passed the church, Reverend Cal stepped out, brushing snow from his coat. "Didn't think I'd see you again so soon," he said. Wilder tipped his hat. "We're building our own congregation." Cal smiled in that quiet way of men who have lived long enough to see things broken and mended. By December, the house held a new stillness. Not empty, but waiting. The hollyhocks hadn't survived the frost, but Olive pressed some leaves in a book anyway. Wilder spent his evenings carving a set of wooden animals, a horse, a goat, a cow for the child to hold when the time came. Ellie stayed through the winter. He took up a cot in the old storeroom and earned his keep without complaint. Olive taught him to bake, though he burned the first 4 loaves. Wilder loaned him a book of maps and found him staring at Kansas one night, brow furrowed like he meant to head there someday. But not yet. The baby came in early spring, just as the last of the snow melted off the ridge. A girl, red-faced and strong-lunged, with Olive's mouth in Wilder's hands. They named her Clara. That night Wilder held her by the fire, her head cradled in his palm. Olive dozed nearby, hair damp, the quilt pulled to her chin. "She's got your look," he whispered. Olive didn't open her eyes. "She's got your steadiness." He leaned down and kissed her temple. "You made this house a home, Olive." "I just filled what was already waiting." Wilder reached for her hand and she curled her fingers through his. Outside, the grass was greening, the wind soft against the eaves. The cradle creaked gently in the corner and the fire burned low, warm and steady like everything they'd built. They had no need for more words, not now, not ever. They were home, together, always.